the one last night. Maybe his music is too loud. I'm not exactly sure. Let me just tone it down for my own case. Okay, so a bit of a talk about the differences in dopamine intake, and that's coming from personal experience, having been without the internet, having been without video games, having been without TV for a part of my childhood, and actually having the transitional period. So when it came to video game, it started around four. When it came to heavier TV use, it was around that time, but it was still a time at around three, four that wasn't as heavily, you know? So there wasn't as much as a media or wasn't as much as media consumption as the time of transition towards video games. There was still playing outside, uh, whether it's playing outside or playing inside, creating scenarios, creating, mock up TV shows and such with my brother and various other friends that would come around. There was still a period where the imagination was allowed to go wild. There was more focus on the five to six senses. Well, intuition wasn't necessarily known at that age, but at times there were times where it was acting upon, synchronicities and such. So up till four, then first game gotten was a Game Boy and Tetris. Tetris was my jam. Super Mario Land was there, but Tetris was my jam. This is how it got me to clean my room. Yeah, Peterson style. But yeah, Tetris got me into organization and placement, because I was getting better and better and better at that. Still, it was starting to eat up the dopamine more than TV had for me. So my parents had radio and had the newspaper as well. They also had TV. So when it comes, like, just imagine and consider the dopamine intake from those devices, okay, and from those tools. Because for a refresher on dopamine, what the dopamine is it's that chemical, that reward chemical in your body, okay? So the tricky thing is when you experience something new, that can kick in because it's a bit of a reward on its own. Newness, accomplishment, achievement, uh, quote unquote, growing or learning. And I say quote unquote because some of the stuff that were in the newspaper were obviously tailored and manufactured to sell. They weren't necessarily real. They didn't necessarily have an entirety of context and understanding of the situation. They were oftentimes just leading you to judge whoever was described in the paper, but you didn't know the actual person. Still, it brought an aspect of learning, quote unquote, an aspect of growth with that. So that's like when you kind of imagine the frequency of reading the newspaper or listening to something on the radio, you can kind of see kind of a level of dopamine intake. Okay, you can start seeing it as a, let's say, a bottom level per se. Then when it comes to TV and such, again, you get newness, you get uh, an aspect of simulated growth, simulation of a growth in a sense, um, because you are learning certain things and various new things from the various shows, yet it's not having actual physical experience. That's why I kind of call it a simulation of growth. So you get that at a much faster frequency and pace. So you got to go come stand by or stay tuned to watch the next part of the series or the next part of the show or a continuing series or a pay per view event. So you have it live, you have it ready, you have it in your hand. You can switch the channel and get some more newness. So from that, you can start seeing you as you have more control over that quest for newness and growth, your intake of that media grows. You want more. Your body kind of gives you that high whenever it kicks in, that dopamine kicks in. So you want more of that high. You just want to consume more. So you click. You've seen the stereotype, but you got to watch out. You got to watch out. It's not just a stereotype. It's like click, change, 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 because the body wants more newness. It wants to find something interesting and then grow from it. So, ooh, cool, that newness. It's let's say it's a UFC fight. Okay, I'll stick to that. Boring. Okay, I'll go for something else, something else, something else, right? So you can see that as another level of dopamine intake in a sense. Video games. You are the main character. You take control of that character. You get to play through that dialogue and through that scenario. So early on, one, there was a limitation of channels, when it comes to TV, but there was also a limitation to the amount of games that could be acquired or even known about or even touched. Because back then, you'd rent them for one weekend or whatever your schedule is, but you would have a limitation of access to that. Still, when you play as that character or in whatever scenario you're being pushed, it is newness that you are actively controlling. You're actively, quote unquote, developing too with the character. Level up, new equipment, new items, being able to tackle on new bosses with new skills. So you're actively growing, quote unquote, simulated growth, but it still counts as growth. And your body is just loving that newness because you're having uh, you are a variable in that scenario. You can change how the scenario is kind of being played. Not everyone's gonna go light punch, light punch, light punch on any characters they face. They'll change jump kick, jump high kick. There's variations to it. So there's a nice feeling that comes in when you clear those objectives, you clear those boss fights, you acquire new technique, you acquire new skills. There's that feeling, that dopamine hit, you know? Plus, with the visual, depending on the game, you're getting even more of a dopamine hit because the beautiful visual signaling a reward or something cool that happened, a critical hit, bam, it just adds that kick, that feel to that feeling. So that's another dopamine hit level. But again, we were restricted to, let's say, the weekend or the certain level or the certain availabilities of certain game at the game store or at the rental store. So there was a limitation. Then the internet kicked in. The internet before the 2000, around the 2000 here, there was a specific program by Bell that would allow families to have high access to DSL and higher speed frequency for internet. So when that kicks in, when you dive into the internet, you have access to so much material. Well, unlimited. That includes the dark web, but unlimited types of material. You have access to much faster and a much wider aspect of selection of subjects. YouTube. Before or after Napster, YouTube just gives you access to so much material, so much content. So your body's just growing, searching, growing, learning, searching, growing, learning. The cycle happens much faster and on a much grander scale. So this is a bit of an X factor because then you get to see that the dopamine intake. We won't talk about social media because that's adds even more. You at that point you don't even have to type into Google to search something or doing a search on YouTube. You just keep scrolling and you are getting that aspect of newness and pseudo growth in a sense simply by, I won't call it pseudo growth, it's simulated growth in a sense. And even that could be a term I'll refine later on because there's a part of it that's growth, but it's not necessarily the fullest of your potential. Still, you're getting that dopamine kick higher and higher at a much faster rate than the video game, the TV, media, and movie, and even when it comes to you, how do you say, playing outside and doing your own play, your own creations, because your intake just kind of comes in via discovering newness instead of creating newness. Since we're up to 8 billion and then some, but you know, just keep the billion number in mind. The amount of content that was already ready on the internet was just vast. So the intake and the senses of newness were just going wild. And the body eventually starts developing an idea that, okay, well, this is the standard of what is, this is the dopamine standard. This is you could say, this is at what rate I should get this kick of dopamine because it got used to it. So there's a transition that eventually happened. And now it's doing the work to step back and detach from what that you could say evolution of mediatic evolution has led to, because then after the internet there comes the streaming services, or with the internet came the streaming services and services that made games much more accessible. So you're getting that you-ness in a snap of a finger without necessarily creating anything for yourself or seeking it out, or having to move to get it. It's just on hand at a much faster pace, easily controlled too, right with your specific search and request and your tailored desires. So it became a tad bit of a double-edged sword over time, because dopamine regulation wasn't necessarily a thing. It wasn't necessarily a subject that was brought onto us. It became a bit more noticeable when, you start seeing people walking outside with the cell phone down, and you start going, whoa, wait, some of these people are actually getting killed. What's happening now? And a higher or more frequent discussion about the subjects of dopamine and what affects it became more and more public view. Not as often or not as much as we would want to, because this is the kind of stuff you would want to know right before you have a device or even interact with these things. Because at the same time, and I've mentioned it multiple times before, when you focus on a screen, okay, whether it's a video game, TV, movie, or even this cell phone, your dopamine, well, okay, not just the dopamine, but your 5 to 6 senses, you don't use as much of them because your attention is focused here, now, on what I am telling you or what is it being presented to you. But again, while this is happening, nothing's really getting your attention to your mind and body, whether it's the subconscious mind or your 5 to 6 senses. There's barely any attention to it. And that can become a bit of a problem over time, or an unbalancement. There's no game over. You will never be able to balance this. No, 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 no. You can always rebalance. You just gotta take the time to be mindful about this. But we didn't get that at first. We were sold these things like candy. And they basically kind of acted like candy because the body loved to get that feeling of newness and simulated growth, which is still a kind of growth, but that would be another chapter, something else to talk about. Because you can actually flip the edge. Meaning, I spoke about the negative edge, but there's a positive edge to it as well. Everything has two sides, yet it's being aware of those two sides and the multiplicity of gray zones, but at least the two main sides, advantages and disadvantages to these things, that can help us balance our intake, as well as regulate our dopamine back. So it's interesting. It's kind of fascinating how all of this kind of came, and real fast. I mean, I can only imagine the people technically working with VR or staying in VR for a longer amount of time. It's tricky to say, but it's kind of like understanding that VR doesn't represent or won't necessarily replicate your 5 to 6 senses. All right. So logically, you can perceive that spending an extended amount of time in the VR is basically going to become a bit detrimental to that. On top of the fact that, hey, depending on the material and subjects that you tackle on in VR, you're still getting subconscious programming, because you're still listening to a very surface level perception that's being bombarded. The limitation of scripts in movies, the limitation of what can be portrayed about the human being, not the human body and the surface level face and personality, but the human being, the thoughts, the ideas, the um, hell, the mental programming, the geez, the amount of thoughts and visualizations that happen, the feelings that they bring. We don't necessarily have anything that can truly represent a variation of nuance of feelings in the moment. Um, like, and at the rate and the speed that it goes to. So we don't necessarily have that being represented. And thus, if you don't necessarily have a continuous reminder of that, and you're constantly concentrated and focused on the screen or whatever device is in front of you, you're basically not paying attention to what's going on internally. And that over time can become a bit of an issue. Remember, everything that you repeat over time becomes subconscious, it becomes normal. So if you're continuously hearing a dialogue or a kind of way of perceiving the world in a negative way, a lackluster way, and blah, 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 well, that's going to become your new normal. And then you get the repercussion just for the abundance of media and technology that you had access to without understanding your own internal human functioning. Limitations of the time, but there are certain people and entities that do would prefer to have most of the population asleep in those specific ways. So it's all an aspect of balance. There's some cool stuff that you can learn with those games, with those TV, with those movies, and with those shows. Yet you still want to balance out that time to put more time on the internal person, uh, the inside of yourself, mostly due to the fact that you are much smarter than any of those main characters, and you will achieve so much more in so much of a faster time than any of those media representation, you know? And don't get caught into the whole representation thing aspect of things. That's just labels, terminologies. Some would call it constructs. You don't necessarily want to have your brain tied to a label and say, "Oh, this character represent me because of that label," and slowly and surely I will start acting like that. Fuck that crap. That becomes a disadvantage, especially that we're all different, all unique and different, all having different contexts, different perceptions, different lives. So keep that in mind. Have fun with this and consciously ask yourself, revise your life up till this point. No judgment, but revise it to see the different kind of changes that happened internally in the different stages of your life when you had access to these devices. You know, just pay attention to that and start asking the deeper questions. And, you know, just kind of ask yourself, where do I want to bring this to? What would feel better? What would feel more optimal? You can also ask why, which will reinforce that very same question to easily facilitate you going into that direction. But we're at a point where we're balancing this stuff, and we didn't fucking know. They didn't fucking, you know, when it came to our parents, they didn't know. The people who created those inventions, some of them knew, some of them didn't know. And that's why you don't necessarily want to play the blame game. That's a waste of time. You simply want to be aware, understand how it impacted your life, and then make the changes. And also pass it on. But don't be judgmental. It's tricky to step out of that TV dialogue. All right? And the dialogue that's been brought up to us with those media, whether it's TV, YouTube, or even school, in a sense. If you're to approach this to someone else, approach it as a suggestion instead of you must do this, you know? Or your life would be much better if you did this. You know, it depends on the tonality and the way that you're bringing this. Yet, always bring it as a suggestion, having the person realize it within themselves instead of imposing, which doesn't let you feel it, make the connection between the two or the various stages of your life to feel the difference and then start heading towards something else, knowing that you have the controls to make that change. You got this. As long as you tell your, as long as you have that conscious understanding and you tell yourself that you got this, because that's also the cheat code, you'll get there. It'll become easy after a while. So play with this, have that fun, kick some asses, and let's all play with this rebalancing while being patient with ourselves and everyone else. Because again, it didn't come in with a manual. Should have been the first 5 pages. Warning: extended periods of listening to certain dialogue will keep your perception of reality in that very small finite box, while the reality is, oh, how many are we? 8 billions. So 8 billion perspective, point of views, and different events. So you don't need to stay locked in or to feel judged or to feel comparison. You got this. Let's play with this.